Well, in 2015, 11.5 million documents, highly classified, highly powerful, life-threatening documents were found and released by an anonymous source to the public. They were called the Panama Papers. And the Panama Papers were financial information and attorney and client information to over 200,000 offshore accounts, primarily based right there in Panama. Some of them date back to 1970, all of them showing the signs of tax evasion, money fraud, money laundering, and everything else that is associated with it. A female reporter just last year, 2017, got a hold of the Panama Papers, and she exposed them in a little island right off the coast of Greece called Malta. And she discovered that the Prime Minister of Malta was associated with some of the accounts that were in the Panama Papers and actually had set up his own business in Panama in order to launder the money to it. She exposed the findings last year on October 16th. She went into her car, turned the ignition switch, and it blew up. And her car went over a fence, landed about 20, 30 yards away, led to her immediate death. The event was termed a political murder. All right. Immediately when we hear stories like this, we think this is politics at its worst. This is mafia tactics at its worst. Somebody exposes the hidden truth about a problem, and those in positions of power now proceed with the quickest way to remove the problem through a cover-up plan, no matter what the cost would be. And so, the reporter who exposed the problem all of a sudden becomes the problem. And now the initiative is to remove the problem that has ultimately surfaced through the reporter. Freud got to the heart of this hundreds of years ago. Sigmund Freud had a phrase that he used called the psychogenesis of religion. And Freud would say the beginning of religion for every person. He was completely skeptical of religious purposes for anybody. He said all religion has a beginning. It has a genesis to it. And the beginning of religion for Freud was everybody's need for an infantile, childlike need for a father. So everybody turns to religion like they would turn to a father, somebody who's always there to bail them out, somebody who's always there to protect them no matter what. Freud said people don't pursue God for a real reciprocal relationship with God. They pursue God out of wishful thinking. This whole idea of religion is it doesn't matter what I do in my life. It doesn't matter the decisions that I make, especially Monday through Saturday. What matters is that I have a father who will protect me and who will guard me regardless of those decisions. Freud basically called everybody to the carpet on their religion. And he said, you can go to church once a week and have a wishful thinking help you feel better about yourself based on this whole idea of religion, when in reality, behind the scenes, it's just a cover-up job. In reality, you're using your religion to think better about yourself because you know that you've got some deep problems. You're not fooling anybody. It's just a cover-up job. Jesus said the same thing thousands of years before that. Jesus said to the religious leaders, you guys are using religion to feel better about yourselves, but it's all just a big cover-up job. There's nothing about it. It's a wishful thinking religion so that you can do whatever you want in public. You're going to do whatever you can to cover things up. He tested their leadership. Jesus tested the leadership of the Pharisees by exposing a real and a deep problem. And just like the reporter in Malta, when she exposed the problem, she became the problem. Jesus comes on the scene in the New Testament. He exposes a problem, and so guess what? He becomes the problem. And he must be eliminated. Cover it up at all costs. This morning, we're going to begin a brand new sermon series on leadership. I've entitled this, The Divine Sawmill, and you're going to see why as we go along. Today's just an introduction, really, to some leadership principles. We're talking about God's divine sawmill and how his perfect will is achieved through very imperfect leaders. God's perfect will is achieved through very imperfect leaders. And what we're going to do in this unit is we're going to compare a positive example of leadership from Jesus in the Gospels to a negative example of leadership in Judges. And we're going to go back and forth between these two places and give a good picture of healthy, godly leadership, which ultimately will lead to healthy, godly following of leaders. But what we're all going to have to come to grips with is this idea that every leader, every human leader, aside from Jesus, is imperfect. And we are called to follow very imperfect leaders. Today I want to show you just one thing about good leaders, one thing about good leadership. Every leader is going to, at some point in time, fail. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And there's a way to test the character of a good leader. Jesus tests the character of the leaders in his time, the religious leaders in Judaism. And the way that he tested the leaders was confrontation. Confrontation of leaders will determine whether or not leaders are more concerned about looking spiritual or actually being spiritual. And so Jesus will confront them. He will expose them with an ultimate goal in mind. Are you more concerned about how things look on the outside, or as a leader, are you introspective, self-examining, and concerned about how things look on the inside of who you are? Matthew 23 this morning. I hope you have a Bible. This is the sharpest and most condemning of all chapters of Scripture concerning leadership. And Matthew 23 is a hard text to read. Jesus confronts the leaders, the religious leaders. And we're going to see three things in this text. We're not going to read all of it in detail. We're going to jump around a little bit and bounce some ideas back and forth. There's three questions that I want to ask when Jesus confronts leaders. Who does he confront? Why does he confront them? And then how does he do it? Jesus confronts those in positions of power, those in positions of leadership, and he confronts a specific kind of person. Who are they? Number two, why does he confront them? And number three, how exactly does he do it, and why do they get so mad about that? Before we jump in the context of Matthew 23, just let me paint the context just a little bit. Matthew 23 is written, you're going to start in verse 13, is where we're going to pick up this text. And it begins this way. It says, Matthew 23, verse 13, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." You're going to see that introductory formula. It's an interjection, is what grammarians will call this. Woe to you. You will see this exactly 7 times between verse 13 in Matthew 23 and verse 29. And that phrase, woe to you, is loaded, both in the Old Testament where Jesus takes it from and also in the New Testament when he uses it. First of all, there's 7 woes. And that means this is a complete and a full pronunciation of judgment upon the leaders. Second of all, scholars suggest that these 7 woes are given in pairs. So the first 2 woes come together, the second 2 together, and the third 2 together, and then you have a final 7th woe. The first 2 woes in this passage regard the Pharisees and their followers. The second 2 woes are paired together under the rubric of their teaching. And this is the most content that you get in Matthew 23 concerning the Pharisees. He pronounces a woe, a judgment upon them because of their teaching. The third pair has to do with their obsession with how things appear on the outside. And so Jesus confronts them based on these main 3 things. And then at the very end, the 7th woe then becomes kind of this climactic pronunciation. You guys have rejected every prophet that God has sent to you. Therefore, God has rejected you in your leadership. And it becomes kind of this final pronunciation of wrath and judgment upon that. Grammarians call this language an interjection. You will see this in the Bible. When woes are pronounced, they're used for funeral laments. They are used for accusations, and they are used for threats against other people. In the Old Testament, when you see this, Jesus is picking up on prophetic language here. In the Old Testament, when you see it, it just says woe. There's no identification of who the pronunciation is against. We would call this a judgment oracle if it was happening in the Old Testament. The language was so sharp and so severe, it immediately gained the listener's attention. And they would discover from the context of the passage who the person is speaking to in the Old Testament, the prophet, usually speaking to a leader in that situation. And it was so powerful that they didn't have to say who the woe was to. They simply said, woe, judgment, catastrophe, wrath is coming upon you. And you've paid so close attention to it, you figured it out. It's only in English, especially in the Old Testament, it's only in English that we have to say, woe to you, to figure out who he's talking to. Waltke says this, Bruce Waltke says this in his Old Testament theology. He says, whenever a woe formula is used in Scripture, it always addresses those in power and those who use deception when they have power. So when you see this formula used, whether it's in the prophets or whether it's Jesus right here in Matthew 23, he gives it to people who have power, authority, and leadership. And also those same people who have used deception behind that power and authority. All right? So here we go. And real quick before I do this, I want to give you one last quote from a tweet that I heard this week from one of my favorite pastors. And he said this: the first step to becoming a Pharisee is to immediately judge the Pharisees and hate the Pharisees. The first step to becoming a Pharisee yourself is to immediately hate the Pharisees. So when we read these passages, every leader in every church on the planet will slip and slide into Pharisaical leadership. All of them, without exception. We're sinful and we're finite, and it is way too easy to do that. Before you come down super hard on the Pharisees, look in your own heart and ask yourself if any of these tendencies are there in your positions of leadership. So, you guys are leaders in your home, you're leaders in your workplaces, you're leaders in the church, you're leaders in your school. Leadership is huge in life and in society. You're all going to gain something from these sermon series. And knowing good leadership also fuels good following and humble submission. So, number one in your outline, number one this morning. Who did Jesus confront? Look at verse 13 again. Verse 13 starts, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites. Skip down to verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites. Verse 16, a little different here. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by the oath. Skip down to verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. We're seeing a similar pattern. Verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. That's number 6. And finally, verse 29 is the 7th woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites. Scholars don't know exactly when the Pharisees started. All we do is really speculate. There's an Old Testament word that Pharisee is associated with. The Hebrew for Pharisee simply means separated one. The first extra biblical evidence that we have of the use of the word Pharisee is about 100 BC. And so 100 BC up until the time of Jesus, you're looking at about 100 years, 2 generations probably, that the Pharisees, this camp of Pharisees, had existed in Judaism. But again, we don't know exactly how they started and exactly how they came about. The burr in the saddle of the Pharisees was flirting with the Greco-Roman culture around them. The one thing that the Pharisees staked their whole reputation and their whole life of religion upon was they didn't want to adopt, either knowingly or unknowingly, the pagan practices from the Greco-Roman world that had come to dominate in the society. So the Pharisees were the ivory tower of the day. They thought if they could build the structure high enough, strong enough, and pretty enough, they could protect themselves and their religion from the outside influence from people flirting with the Greco-Roman culture. The distinguishing mark of a Pharisee is simply this. They had a huge emphasis on religious practice as a personal decision, and that your religion was a very individual idea. Remember, Judaism in the Old Testament is a community religion. This is about a family. This is about the tribes of Israel. Everything in society was much more community-oriented than it is individualized and individual-oriented. The Greco-Roman culture was the first culture to come in and say, no, you know what, there's a lot of value to individuals in society. There's a lot of value to the private life. And this is really interesting, right? Because the Pharisees here, they're designed to keep the Greco-Roman pagan culture out. And in reality, they're embracing the Greco-Roman pagan culture aspects that they like and doing away with the aspects of the culture that they don't like. Why do you think Jesus calls them hypocrites? You guys are saying you're doing one thing. I don't want to be a part of that culture, but you're embracing parts of the culture that help you in your identity and your quest for the individual. Skip down to verse 33 real quick. Jesus, probably one of the sharpest statements against the Pharisees. He says, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell?" And we look at this and we say, serpents it's easy enough. We understand why Jesus is calling these guys serpents. They're cunning, they're crafty, they slither into deep, dark places where you don't expect them, and they are ready to pounce on any prey, and you have no clue about it. Brood of vipers is a little bit of a different phrase. Brood of vipers brings a whole different metaphor to the plate. Vipers in this part of the world are very small snakes. In fact, they look almost exactly like sticks. So if you were an Israelite or you lived in this area of the world at this time, you would go out and you would gather sticks for a fire. And you would go and you would look for something that was going to bring you comfort, warmth, and security. And in the meantime, you gather a bundle of sticks, and lo and behold, there's a viper in there. You didn't even see it. All of a sudden, something that looked like it was going to bring you comfort, safety, and warmth latches onto you and bites you. Vipers, even though they're extremely small, their venomous is extremely poisonous. And anybody who is bit by a viper, it would be a slow and a very painful death. But vipers didn't just bite. When vipers bite, they latch on and they hold on as long as they can. This is an extremely graphic metaphor, but then he calls them a brood of vipers. And brood brings on a completely different element to that as well. A brood of vipers is a huge group of them. Well, where do you find broods of vipers? In the desert in the Middle East. You're going to find them under shade trees and in caves in cool places. Jesus is giving this metaphor. He's describing brood of vipers as a person. A brood of viper, a viper is a person who looks like, in the middle of the desert, they offer you shade, coolness, comfort, and every relief you could ask for from the outside. And in reality, they offer pain and death behind the scenes. They look like they offer refuge and rest. In reality, they bring discomfort and death. Now, I love football. I've seen 3 purple shirts today. One of my favorite things about football is it's not only the game that happens on the field. One of my favorite things about football is the game that happens on the sideline. Right? Because in every football game, you've got 2 teams competing against one another on the field. But you also have 2 teams competing against one another on the sideline. On the football field, you've got players competing against one another. On the sidelines, you've got coaches competing not against one another. You've got coaches competing against referees. And it is a fun game to watch. One of my favorite guys to watch, I was a Packer fan, grew up in Wisconsin. One of the favorite coaches to watch was a guy that coached for the Chicago Bears for many, many years. Many of you guys know Mike Ditka. Mike Ditka had a great time on this game versus the refs. Mike Ditka, he looked the part of the authority. Mike Ditka, for every game, he wore a shirt and tie. Great dress pants, like meticulous dress shoes. He slicked his hair, whatever hair he had, he slicked it back. Not a hair out of place. His mustache was just finely combed. And he had these aviator sunglasses, and then he'd put in just this wad of gum in his mouth, and he'd chew those refs out just like he was chewing his gum as hard as he could. I loved watching Mike Ditka go against the refs. And as much as Ditka thought he was the authority, as much as he looked like the authority, on the sidelines, he wasn't the authority. The authority on the sidelines of a football game has to be delegated from the ultimate authority. And the ultimate authority for any football game is not a coach. The ultimate authority for any football game is found in New York City at the headquarters for the National Football League. The ultimate authority is the commissioner of the NFL. And the commissioner of the NFL gives his ultimate authority. He delegates his authority to the referees that wear black and white on the sidelines. And so as much as Mike Ditka wants to pretend that he's authority, that he has all the authority, he is not the final authority. Who does Jesus confront in the Gospels? Jesus is confronting very specific people. These are religious men who looked like they had authority, but they didn't really have any authority. Jesus looks at these men who are in a position of power, or at least perceived power, and he addresses them as people who had an illegitimate authority. They are perceived by the people as having authority, and they constantly remind people of that authority in a desperate attempt to keep that authority. Looks and titles don't grant spiritual authority. God grants spiritual authority. Authority is delegated from above. It is not taken from below. Jesus confronts those who think they have authority, but they actually have no authority. And Jeremiah 5 was this great text that Martin Luther went to when he faced off against the Catholic authorities during the Reformation. And here's what it says. Jeremiah prophesies, he says, "An appalling thing has happened in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule at their own direction," which means the priests rule under their own authority, not my authority. And here's what the very next verse says. It's at the very end of Jeremiah chapter 5. It says, "My people love it that way." Here you've got a false authority who's really no authority, and the people love that authority. Jesus confronts those who look like they have authority on the outside, but they got no authority from above, no authority on the inside. Number 2, why does he confront them? Why does Jesus take on the Pharisees the way that he does, so persistently and pointedly? What is his ultimate beef? C.S. Lewis gives this illustration. It's a great illustration of a group of ships sailing in formation. He says, for a group of ships to sail in formation, you've got to have a number of things. And in this illustration, in Mere Christianity, he says there are 2 ways that a group of ships sailing in formation can go wrong. The first way that a ship can go wrong is if it collides and does damage with another ship. Ultimately, the formation is not going to hold. The second way it can go wrong is if there's an internal engine problem. So you can sail in formation the way that you're supposed to as long as you don't hit anybody else around you, you stay where you're supposed to be, and as long as your engines on the inside are functioning properly. He says, the voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. And you can't have either of those 2 things without the other. But then Lewis says this, there's a third thing that you need. He says the third thing that you have to ask is, do the ships reach the destination that they set out for? Are they following the destination that they planned in the first place? And he says, however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and it ended up in Calcutta. So C.S. Lewis says, sailing a fleet of ships, you've got to have 3 things. You've got to have fair play and no collisions on the outside. You've got to have engines working properly on the inside, and you've got to have the same destination and reach that destination. He gives the whole example is based on morality. He's got a chapter in there called Psychoanalysis of Morality in Mere Christianity. And modern people totally don't get this. We're out to sea on this idea of morality. He said morality has to have 3 things. Morality has to have outside fair play with others. Number two, morality has to have internal harmony within yourself. And then number three, it has to have the same destination. If you don't have those three things, you don't have morality, period, and you specifically don't have Christian morality. Modern people, which one are we obsessed with? We're obsessed with number one. As long as you have fair play and things go well and you don't collide with anybody else, you can actually be a very moral person. We rarely stop to examine the inside, how the engines are functioning. And we totally abandon the destination altogether. Your religion can take you here. Your idea of life can take you there. It doesn't really matter. Just be nice and play fair with others around you. That's our concept of morality. The modern man wants the perception of morality, but they don't want true morality. And here's what he says. Almost all people at all times have agreed in theory that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to begin with all that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might as well have not thought about it at all. He says, unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside of each human being, we are only deceiving ourselves. In any society, in any culture, he says, it is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on, but as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under a new system. He says you cannot make men good by law, and without good men, you can't have a good society. That is why we must press on to the second thing, he says, and that's morality inside the individual. And Lewis is totally consistent with the refrain from Jesus. And I want you to see something in chapter 23. Look down at verse 16. Jesus says, woe to you, and here's a different term. He calls them blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple. Look at verse 17. You blind fools. Look at verse 19. You blind men. Look at verse 24. You are blind guides. You are straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Verse 26. You are blind Pharisees. What were they blind to? What were the religious leaders blind to? On the outside, it was fair play. Nobody was colliding with one another. They were totally blind to the internal engine function. They were totally blind to their own hearts, to morality on the inside. Lexicon says literally that blindness in the New Testament refers to objects without light. In other words, they were blind to their own inner darkness. Now, skip down to verse 27. Jesus says to the Pharisees, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear very beautiful, but within you are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. And so you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And all of us, when we read this chapter, we say, good grief, how did these religious leaders get here? It seems so obvious. How could they have gone from really trying to protect the culture and issue holiness to the people to a situation now where they are totally blind to their own unrighteousness and self-seeking and looking out for their own particular interests and for their own outward appearance? How did we get here? One writer puts it this way, and I think this is great. He says, the Pharisees created their own dynamic, and here's what the dynamic was. How people act is more important than who people are. And they said the dynamic says love and acceptance are earned by doing or not doing certain things. You live up to the standards. And that is what earns your acceptance before other people, which is acceptance only to outward behaviors, not acceptance to people at all. They created a new dynamic where all that mattered was what was on the outside. It had nothing to do with what was on the inside. Why did Jesus confront them? Their morality was based on everything on outward appearances and nothing on internal self-examination. They wanted things to appear really good, even though they weren't really good. Their religion was for one purpose, to look good and to feel better about themselves, and they cloaked it all in the language of holiness and religion. A new dynamic has emerged. Number 3, How does Jesus confront them? Skip back to the beginning of chapter 23, verses 1 through 4 here. Matthew 23, verse 1. Listen specifically to who Jesus is talking to in verse 1. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. They observe whatever they tell you, but not the works that they do, for they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them even with their finger." All the way through chapter 23, 1 through 12, verses 1 through 12, Jesus is talking to the crowds and to the disciples. And he's talking to them about the Pharisees and the scribes. Once you get to verse 13 in chapter 23, there's a drastic shift all of a sudden in the text. And Jesus is not now talking about them, he is talking to them. And he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees," in the first person. See, verses 1 through 12 is a warning about the religious leaders. Verses 13 through 39, he talks to the religious leaders. The first part of chapter 23 is counsel. The second part of chapter 23 is confrontation. The first part is a warning to others. The second part is a woe to them specifically. And the question is why? Right? Why do these guys get so mad when they're confronted by Jesus? And the answer is so obvious and it is plain to see, but it's so simple that it's profound in its simplicity. We often don't think about this. At our dinner table, this is always good sermon fodder when I'd start talking about the dinner table at the Verweel House. There's something very interesting that happens at our dinner table on, not too normal basis, but every once in a while. And every meal that my wife cooks is an amazing meal. It is delicious. And I eat those meals so fast, and they are wonderful. And every once in a while, my kids will agree that these are great meals. They sit in front of the plate, and they take down mom's meals like super, super fast. Right? We're not to the teenage stage, but they're gulping. They're not really chewing their food a lot of times. They just put it in their mouth and swallow it down. You guys have any of that going on at the Rust House over there? Just a few. It's okay to chew every once in a while. And so something happens at our dinner table, perhaps it happens at your dinner table as well, is that when my kids eat really, really fast, out comes this obnoxious, really loud and inappropriate sound. And they're burping and they're belching at the dinner table. And I'm going to be honest and I'm going to confess to you something as a parent. Usually, almost every time that this happens in the privacy of my home, I think it's hilarious. I love it. In fact, we kind of we evaluate them, That was a little weak, It could have been a little deeper and longer, but keep working on it. And so we laugh about it in the privacy of our home. But if you take that same context and we go over to the Nord's house as we're watching a Vikings football game and this happens, or we go to a restaurant and it happens in public, we're not laughing anymore. Now, mom and dad are completely ashamed because something happened that embarrassed us and brought shame to us. And one guy, I think he really gets to the heart of this. He enters in a lot of really good humility to this equation on why Jesus makes these guys so mad when he confronts them. He says this. He says, "There's no such thing as a perfect family or a perfect church where people don't get hurt." Okay, so if you guys are on the quest for the perfect family or the perfect church where people don't get hurt, you're not going to find it this side of glory. There's no such thing. Every church is going to hurt people. It happens. Every church has leaders that hurt people. It happens. He says the difference between an abusive and a non-abusive system is this. We should read something like this. The difference between a religious church and a non-religious church is this. The difference between a church based on religion and do this versus a church based on grace, Jesus has done that for you, is this. While hurtful behaviors may happen in both, it's not permissible to talk about problems in an abusive system out loud. Hence, there is no healing and there is no restoration after the wound has occurred, and the victim is made to feel at fault for questioning or pointing out the problem. I think this goes right along with a lot of what you guys said this morning. So I want to get just really more specific about this because this is a key aspect in the text that we often overlook. Jesus wasn't a problem because of what he thought about the religious leaders. Jesus became a problem because of what he said about the religious leaders. Jesus wasn't a problem because of what he said in private. Jesus was a problem because of what he said in public. Jesus wasn't a threat because he addressed a problem. Jesus was a threat because he addressed a problem out loud where other people could hear it. And he broke one of the Pharisees' most sacred, most protected, and most abusive of all unwritten rules. And that rule is the can't talk rule. And the Pharisees initiated a can't talk rule which goes something like this. The real problem cannot be exposed because then it would have to be dealt with and things would have to change. And so the onus behind the can't talk rule, silence is golden. Silence is the fortress wall of protection. If you talk about the problem, you become the problem. And now you are the problem that needs to be removed. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus. The unwritten rule says you can say or you can ask whatever you want in public. Just make sure it doesn't make us look bad as religious leaders. And the onus is put on the appearance of things. And the truth is, exposing a problem doesn't make you the problem. It just means you exposed the problem. And you want it to be dealt with so that things can change. Okay, this sounds really nice, Jared. All right, what about Romans 13? What about Hebrews 13? What about submitting to those who are in authority over you? 1 Peter chapter 5. These guys, Jesus comes in here, he just starts running the mouth. Shouldn't he have met with them first and done this in a more palatable and much more respectable way? And absolutely he did do that. Over and over again, he did. Men who have authority will say, there's a certain protocol you have to follow, just don't disrespect authority. You disrespected us in public. You're the problem. What about submission? What about obedience? What about trusting God? Doesn't God call us to submit to ungodly leaders as well as those who are godly? I mean, he asks us to submit to Nero and all kinds of other crazy people. We suffer out of our submission to God, right? I want to read this really carefully. It's not my words. It says, if followers are coerced to obey or follow orders in order to avoid being shamed or to gain somebody else's approval, that's not true obedience and that's not true submission. It is compliant self-seeking. When followers are coerced to obey or to follow orders in order to avoid being ashamed or gain somebody else's approval, that's not true obedience or submission. It's compliant self-seeking. When behavior is legislated from the outside, it is not obedience. It is weak compliance to external pressures. And so Ed Flores got this great statement. He says, leadership is completely different than legislation. You can't legislate morality, but you can lead in morality. And there's a huge difference between legislation and leadership and how those things take place. And he's absolutely spot on. Behavioral legislation from the outside will never touch identity on the inside. And it'll never touch the grace of God. That is works. That is people-pleasing. That is not God-pleasing. Why were the Pharisees so offended to the point of killing Jesus? It is so simple. It is profound. Jesus didn't just make them look bad. Jesus made them look bad in public. And that's when the stakes got raised. And I'm a Dallas Seminary graduate. I know great and wise things that other people just don't know. And one of the things that I do know is Matthew chapter 23 is right towards the end of his ministry in the Gospels. And we are just chapters away from the Last Supper, from the betrayal of Jesus to his crucifixion. This was the linchpin. This was the climax. This was the turning point. You guys haven't listened to me in private. I'm going public. He exposed the problem, and so he became the problem. And there's a huge principle behind this. The truth was that the ego of the religious leaders was threatened. More importantly, their precious self-image was threatened, and Jesus made them look bad. Instead of examining the problem inside their hearts, it was Leah for Rachel. Let's substitute a fake problem so we can not have to deal with the real problem. And that was how they led through this whole situation. They substituted the real problem for the fake one, and it was a huge cover-up job. The principle is this: if those who notice a problem become a problem, you've got a problem. Talking to a friend not too long ago, and he gave me a really good heart-to-heart on leadership. I'm 36. I've made more mistakes in leadership, and by far, this is my biggest failure. In leadership, he said, in any leadership position, it doesn't matter if you're a mom, if you're a dad, if you're a grandpa, if you're a CEO, a businessman, or or any other thing. It doesn't really matter. So in any position of leadership, you always have two options of how you can lead. The first option he called the soft, warm, and fuzzy option of leadership. The soft, warm, and fuzzy option of leadership is really easy leadership, because in a soft, warm, and fuzzy type of leadership, all you have to do is manage how things appear on the outside. You never really have to deal with real issues that are on the inside. So all of us as leaders, we have an option. We can adopt a soft, warm, fuzzy leadership that basically comes around to managing behaviors and how things are dealt with in public. There's another aspect of leadership that he said was a better and a deeper and a greater option. He said that option is courageous leadership. That option for courageous leadership is not soft, it's not warm, it's not fuzzy, and it's not easy. It's actually a lot harder. It's courageous because it demands a lot of things from leaders. Number one, it demands that leaders respond a certain way when they are confronted. That they examine themselves first before they start examining everything else. Number two, it demands that leaders be open and honest about their weaknesses and their failures. That's courageous leadership. Not hiding behind closed doors, not cover up jobs, not pretending like everything is okay on the outside when really it's not okay on the inside. Courageous leadership is leadership where you deal with real issues, you deal with conflicts, you work through conflict. Ken Sande's book on peacemakers, conflict is an opportunity to glorify God. We've got a conflict, we are going to press into this conflict. You are not the problem because you expose the problem. What I want to do is courageously accept responsibility and what have I played in a part of this problem. And then we can talk about it. All of us have, this is my biggest leadership failure since I've been here in the last 5 years, is I haven't been functioning out of courageous leadership. I've been way too concerned about how things look on the outside, and I want to ask for your guys' forgiveness in that. I'm weak as a leader. I have failed many times. You've heard me confess sins from the pulpit and even from congregational meetings and how I've failed. It's really, really interesting when politicians go to the pulpit and they're asked the tough questions or problems are raised. You know, what's the first mode of action? Duck and cover, right? Let's really try to color this in a way. Let's divert. Let's make it look like we're okay and we're doing really well. Jesus' form of leadership. Think about Jesus' leadership on the outside. What did it look like? Did Jesus look like a great and wonderful leader on the hill of Calvary? Did Jesus look like this guy who wanted all the outward appearances to look like he had control, that he was making every right decision, that there was no way that the people were going to ever find out about his leadership style or anything like that? Jesus' style of leadership was he who looks the weakest is actually the strongest. Jesus' style of leadership was to be vulnerable and naked and open before everybody and say, I've held nothing back from you. You know me. This is what it means to be a good leader. Isn't somebody who's got everything polished, perfect, and sounds really good. A good leader is the one who can show weakness, show vulnerability, admit mistakes, lower their pride, and in humility walk with people in such a way that you can absolutely and 100% trust them. That is leadership. We don't like that kind of leadership in our world. We are convinced that leadership looks a certain way. Whether it's the clothes you wear, the things you say, the speeches you give, Jesus' leadership says, that's how the world functions. Right? That's how the Gentiles lead. They're going to coerce everybody into it based on appearances. Jesus doesn't care about any of that. Jesus cares about the heart. And I think we got to do a lot more caring about the heart. Skip down. Let me give you 2 principles, and we'll be done. Turn to James chapter 4, and we're going to end on this one. James 4. Again, the purpose of this sermon series in this unit is to talk about leadership and to identify good leadership when you see it, and also to know what it looks like if it's not good leadership and if it's things that we struggle with. But we also have to deal with the reality that all of us, I'm telling you guys, the first step to becoming a Pharisee is to judge the Pharisees and hate the Pharisees. So all of us, I'm asking all of us to look inside of our hearts, and before we judge others, let's look into what we have contributed and the issues in our own hearts. James chapter 4, verse 1. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? The conflict is not outside of you, James says. The conflict is inside of you. The conflict is inside all of us. Really quick principle. Great leaders, when they are confronted, they look within before they look without. Great leaders look within themselves before they look outside of themselves to somebody else. James chapter 4, verse 1. Matthew chapter 7, why do you look at the speck that is in the brother's eye and you don't even know the log that is in your own eyes? Good leaders are givers and takers. They're givers of credit, givers of compliments, and they are takers of responsibility. Good leaders, when things go well, they will praise other people. When things go bad, they will take it on themselves and look into their own heart. When things go good, it's not because of them. When things go bad, it's because of them. And they are quick to assume responsibility. And so good leaders will always ask this question from Ken Sandy: what have I contributed to the problem? Number 2, great leaders are more concerned about the hard truth than false appearances. Great leaders are more concerned about the hard truth than false appearances. Truth must trump image for great leaders. Otherwise, it's just a cover-up job. And you're using your religion for wishful thinking to make you feel better about yourself. Courageous leadership. The other thing is interesting about how so many in the church have aborted babies using their religion maybe for different purposes than other things. It's a interesting parallel. Next week, we're going to jump into Judges 1. I think we've got a final song that we want to sing this morning.